It worked. Oh, it doesn't want to advance my slides already. So I'd like to start off poking a little fun at ourselves here. I've been a forester for 23 years since I graduated Humboldt State University with a degree in forestry. Sometimes I get the feeling that the cartoon portrays how people think about foresters. I don't feel that like those two gentlemen. I know there are people here that definitely are not going to agree with a lot of things that I have to say, and that's fine. But I think there's definitely two big things that I have in common with most people in this room. And the first is that I love trees. I love forests. That's why I studied forestry. I grew up in Massachusetts, roaming the woods around my parents' house in the suburbs where I grew up, which unfortunately most of those woods now, my parents still are in their house. And when I go back, most of those woods are cul-de-sacs and houses now. I moved to Southern California when I was 19 and quickly realized it wasn't for me. The climate was warm and sunny, but there were way too many people and not enough trees. And so I found the redwoods up in Arcata, California, in Humboldt, and fell in love with them, with the massive old beautiful trees and forests up there. Decided to study forestry, and in my career over 23 years, I've got to work in Northern California, in Alaska, in Maine, and finally made my way back to my home state of Massachusetts about 9 years ago, and came to work for Water Supply as the forester in the Ware River watershed. And then when Hermack retired as chief forester, I became chief forester about a little over a year ago. So I think love of trees, you don't become a forester. The picture on the bottom right is me in the woods of Maine sometime in 2009 when I worked for the Maine Forest Service as a district forester. Their version of, in Massachusetts, we have service foresters who enforce the regulations. In Maine, it's the district foresters who work for the Maine Forest Service. In that picture, it was a cold December day. I was eating cold leftover spaghetti, sitting on a stump in the middle of a clear cut that we were investigating for being an illegal harvest. And there's always ruts and logging slash and all sorts of debris. And we're still having fun with coworkers and enjoying ourselves in the woods. It's my favorite saying in forestry is a bad day in the field beats a good day in the office. So that's really why I got into forestry, is the love of outside. And another thing that I think I have in common with a lot of you is my concern about climate change. On a professional level, we're thinking about it all the time because it affects our forests. But I also am the father of 2 young kids, and I think all the time about the world that they're going to inherit. And it's frustrating to see the lack of action. And so I totally understand that. And I get frustrated all the time when I look at, the U.S. is producing record numbers of barrels of oil per day right now, and we can't seem to get away from burning fossil fuels, the real cause of climate change. And I would love to see more action on that front. So I feel you there. That's 2 big things. I think probably where we start to disagree is that I really feel that local, sustainably, responsibly harvested wood is going to be part of the solution to that problem, and that basically most of the wood in Massachusetts comes from somewhere else. And so we kind of have a responsibility to try to produce some of the wood that we use, that the people of this state use here, as opposed to putting that burden on people in forests that are elsewhere. So I'll give you a quick overview of my presentation. I'm going to talk about the water supply system, and I have to run through this quick. I'm going to apologize already because I've practiced this a few times, and it'll be a miracle if I get done with this in an hour, but we'll make sure there's time for questions. Talk about the water supply system and the forest filter and water quality, why we like the forest as a filter. Talk probably too much about Quabbin forest history and forestry history. Talk about the disturbances that affect forests, and then talk about basically our current goals and our current process for doing forest management here. So Boston's water supply system, the water that you see out front at the Quabbin provides the drinking water for 3.1 million people in this state. That's roughly 40% of our population. And you can see on the map that water, most of it ends up east over by Boston Harbor, the big blue splotch over there on the right-hand side. All those communities that are a little bit darker shaded are the communities that use our water. There are a few towns out this way, Chicopee and some other towns that get some water too. The safe daily yield of the system, basically how much water we can safely take and that will be replenished by the watersheds, is about 300 million gallons a day. And right now the daily use averages somewhere around 200 million and change. That's a yearly average, so it fluctuates seasonally. And you see all the land that was taken. The system was basically created back in the 20s and 30s by the Metropolitan District Commission. So we used to be known as MDC. They took a lot of land. They had the forethought to realize that, you know, it was important not just to be trying to get water, but they needed to protect the land around the water to ensure that the water would be clean. And that came from learning that lesson many times, as many water sources for Boston and the surrounding area became polluted and unusable. So by the time they got around to the Quabbin, they kind of went big, protected a lot of land. We basically have around 56,000 acres of land around the Quabbin and another 24,000 acres of land around Ware River. So about 80,000 acres of land that I'm responsible for helping manage. Overall, water supply has over 100,000 acres of land. And you can see in Quabbin Reservoir that 56,000 acres basically is about 62% of the overall watershed. So there is still private land out here. And in Ware River, it's about 41%. And I should add that those percentages include land that we have conservation restrictions, or we call them watershed protection restrictions. So most of that is going to be land that we own in fee, but where we have watershed protection restrictions, it's actually still owned by a private landowner, but we've bought the development rights. Now, instead of MDC, where Mass Water Resources Authority owns basically all the infrastructure and gets the water to the ratepayers and collects revenue from the people who pay their water bills. And Mass DCR, Division of Water Supply Protection, who I work for, manages all that land and the surface or the source water. So because of that, we're funded a little differently than the rest of DCR. Mass Water Resources Authority actually has a fund that's generated from the ratepayers. They pay for all of our operating costs, so they pay for our budget. They also obviously are paying to maintain and run the system and get the water to everybody. They also pay pilot, payment in lieu of taxes, which is basically goes to the towns where we own land to basically make up for lost tax revenue. And they also are paying, investing, they're the ones who are buying more land and trying to improve the protection out here. So some of that money goes to protecting more land and buying more conservation restrictions. So we're responsible basically for protecting this system forever. And that's a big responsibility that we're thinking about. It's an amazingly effective system. It's basically allowed Boston and Massachusetts to be the wonderful place that it is. And it is basically unfiltered, so there's no filtration plant. They do treat the water with ozone and chlorine and adjust the pH, but there's no actual filtration plant, which plays into things. So the Safe Drinking Water Act was passed in the 70s and then amended in the 80s and the 90s. And there's a rule about surface water, which we are, as opposed to like groundwater aquifer type, well type source, that basically required a filtration plant or a source control waiver to get away from that building a filtration plant. And there was an actual lawsuit. The federal government sued back when we were still MDC in 1988 or 1998, sued MDC to try to force them to build a filtration plant. And in the end, it was decided that the forest land that we had and the land around the water source was the best filter. And we basically have to demonstrate, we still have that waiver. We have to demonstrate control of our watersheds. We have a lot of programs. There's a lot of water sampling that our staff does, that our environmental quality staff does to monitor the water quality. We have programs to control beavers and gulls and geese, things that can put bacteria and pathogens into the water. We don't try to get rid of them. We just try to make sure that they're in places where they're not going to be affecting the water. And the forest management program is part of that whole list of programs we have that shows that we're protecting the source water. So we like to say, even though it's an unfiltered water supply, it's really not unfiltered, it's forest filtered. This is an example of one of 4 of Toronto's treatment filtration plants. Obviously, if we had to build a filtration plant, it would be expensive and it would be very fossil fuel and carbon intensive. So that's important to remember. That's basically one of the alternatives, but it takes a lot of fossil fuels to run a filtration plant. So we like to say we have the forest biofilter that's working 24 hours a day on free solar energy. The way the things we think about with the forest filter, the way it works, I mean, basically, if you're a raindrop, where you land makes a big impact on your ability to transport pollutants into water bodies. So if you're landing on like impervious surfaces or exposed soil, you're going to have a much greater chance of bringing pollutants into that water. If you land in the forest and hit a leaf or a tree first and filter into the soil, it slows everything down. It allows the pollutants to settle out. Much better for water quality. So basically, we think that you know, a really healthy, vigorous forest with a diverse mix of tree species and stand ages will be the best filter for the long term. And that's basically what we are thinking about when we're managing. Not going to go into too much of the history of the actual building of the place, but just you know, the visitor center does a ton of really nice presentations about the history of Quabbin and what went into building this. It's an amazing system, but just keep in mind, it couldn't be replicated today. It was quite a feat of engineering. And when you see how some of the things out here work, it's pretty amazing. But it was also in the middle of the Great Depression. So people were really desperate for jobs. Land prices were obviously way cheaper than they are now. They basically erased 4 towns to build this reservoir. So they, you know, exhumed bodies from cemeteries and moved them. They took down all the buildings. They basically just erased 4 towns and had to relocate all those people. So this is a finite resource. We're not going to have a chance to add on to this. And so that's something that we keep in mind all the time. We need to be thinking not just about today, not 10 years from now, not 50 years, 100 years, and basically perpetuity, and being able to react to any changes that are happening or anything that comes our way. And obviously climate change is one of those big things that we're thinking about that's going to have a big impact in the future and is already having a big impact. And I like to think, you know, as you're standing out front and you're looking at this beautiful reservoir and all you can see is water and trees for as far as you can see, you know, when you see the picture on the top, you think what this valley would have looked like if we hadn't protected it for water supply. And think about the fact that all this water is going to 40% of our population that lives in one little corner of this state. And where would all those people be living if they didn't have a source of water? How would this state be different? You know, they would probably be a lot more spread out in the forest, and there'd be more cul-de-sacs where more kids are playing in the woods right now. So I like to think about those things. And looking into the future, I think this place is only going to become more important given climate change and other issues like PFAS, things that are polluting water supplies. You know, MWA does feasibility studies all the time about adding communities, and there is the possibility to add more communities onto this system. So long term, it could be even more important. What we're here to talk about today is how they decided to build the watershed protection forest. we know kind of a general history of forests in this area and in this region. Is, a lot of folks understand that. We have some more specific information, and we're going to talk about the general history, but we have some more specific information about Quabbin in particular from some early reports. So the one on the left there is the general forestry report for the Quabbin Reservoir and Ware River watersheds from 1941. And it was written by Russell Snow, who was actually an assistant civil engineer. So they didn't even have foresters working on this at that point. He was an assistant civil engineer. My grandmother always wanted me to be an engineer. So I guess I can feel good that at least at some point engineers were doing forestry. The one in the middle is 1961. It's actually a master's thesis from a UMass forestry student named Fred Hunt, where he established a continuous forest inventory that we'll talk about. And there is some information about basically what the forest looked like in 1960 when he was collecting his data. And we'll get more into that. And then the one on the right is the 1972 Watershed Forest Management Plan for the Quabbin Reservation that was written by Bruce Spencer and Charles Walker, who were both foresters employed by the Metropolitan District Commission, the MDC. And I thought Bruce was going to be here in person today, but he's still around. I guess he's joining us remotely. So we do have some pretty interesting early information. But just to start with New England forests in general and in southern New England, this is the Harvard forest models that I'm sure some of you are familiar with. The picture on the left would be kind of the pre-European contact forest, and there's been a lot of research looking at the patches of old growth, as they call it, old forest, where we still have it and where we had it. There's been a lot of speculation and research about what that forest looked like. We just had a really good presentation by Tony D'Amato from UVM, who's done quite a bit of research. Learned a lot from him, but basically we know, as Maria mentioned, there were people living here before Europeans, so we can't forget that. There was indigenous folks living in this forest and using it. They had some intentional cultural practices that they did, like the intentional use of fire. The extent of that and the amount of people has been a pretty heated debate among people who like to talk about that. But they did have some amount of impact on that forest. In fact, it's kind of sad that throughout American history, the impact that they had has been kind of intentionally downplayed to justify European expansion, taking over territory, basically saying that the land wasn't being used and there was nobody living here. So we know that wasn't the case. We know that those old forests were, that the area was basically mostly old forest, and that they were dominated by really large, really old trees, sometimes 300 or 400-year-old trees. Dominated those forests, but we also know that they were pretty diverse because there was thousands of years of natural disturbances, small and large scale, that happened. So lots of large trees, old trees, lots of large dead standing trees, lots of large dead trees on the ground from disturbance and just kind of natural mortality. And wherever that was occurring, there were younger trees of all ages and size classes springing up and taking advantage of those disturbances. So very diverse forest. And then obviously the middle slide is kind of once the Europeans settled here, it was kind of that European slash and burn agriculture model where they pretty heavily in this area cleared just about all the trees that were here, tried to move all the indigenous people out, and tried to make it more productive, is with what they, in their minds, that's what they were doing. They were trying to put this land to make a living, scratch a subsistence farming life out of this land. A lot of sheep grazing happened. That's where we get our stone walls from. A lot of subsistence farming, raising crops and hay. And that definitely shaped a lot of this landscape pretty intensively. And then we know basically between the Civil War, the Industrial Revolution, the development of railroads, the people moving further west and south and finding more fertile soils and longer growing seasons, easier places to farm. Basically, there was a collapse of agriculture in this region in the late 1800s and into the early 1900s, and certainly at the time that the Quabbin was being formed. And so basically what you see on the slide on the right there is, in 1930, a lot of what was out here, if it was forest, it was really young forest that was just growing back, typified by really dense stands of a lot of small trees, taking over on the lack of agriculture. And then in this area, another big thing that we can't forget about is the hurricane of 38. So this is a picture of Harvard's Pisgah old growth forest that they had protected earlier in the 1900s and done a lot of research. Some of the information we have about old growth stands comes from this area, from that area. It's in southern New Hampshire. When the 38 hurricane came, unfortunately, it wreaked havoc on a lot of this area. And basically the trees that were taller and older at that point were the ones that were the most heavily affected. That's what happens in those big wind events. So the hurricane of 38 happened on September 21st, 1938. We get to play Where's Waldo here. If you look in the pictures, there's always, they like to have a person in there for scale. So sometimes you can find the person. Just a couple interesting things about the hurricane of 38, according to the National Weather Service. Both the max sustained winds and the max wind gust were actually recorded at the Blue Hill Observatory in Massachusetts, east of here. The max sustained wind was 121 miles an hour, and the max wind gust was 186 miles an hour. So it was a big storm with lots of winds. I think the eye of the storm was like 50 miles wide. And the National Hurricane Center estimates that when that storm made landfall, it was moving at 47 miles per hour. So think about a storm coming in at 47 miles per hour and trying to outrun that. They didn't have a very good weather forecasting back then. So a lot of people were caught by surprise. There were 50-foot waves in Gloucester, Massachusetts. And the storm actually killed 700 people. 99 of them were in Massachusetts. And it wasn't just winds. About 4 days before the hurricane hit, there was pretty heavy rains. And in some areas in the 4 days before the storm and including the hurricane, 17 inches of rain fell in 4 days. So that had a huge impact too. Destroyed billions of trees, particularly the taller ones. And topography and where the trees were in relation to the track of the storm had a huge impact on what trees were spared and what trees were destroyed. This is from the 1941 report. So the map on the left is, you can see the title up at the top there. It's hardwood areas which require cleaning up of hurricane slash, and scrub oak gray birch areas which should be thinned out and underplanted. So unfortunately, they didn't separate those two. I would have been really interested just to see what was the hurricane damage. But what they call the scrub oak and gray birch areas were most likely second growth white pine stands that had grown back after the original clearing and then had been logged again in 1941. And they actually have a photo of what a typical hardwood area looked like after the hurricane. We know, you can tell by the title at the bottom that this is one of the Quabbin archive photos or real estate photos. And I love these photos because they always have somebody in a suit standing there. I particularly like this one. We know that this photo was taken on 202 in Pelham, looking northwesterly on November 18th, 1941. And I just imagine they put the people in there for scale. So I'm guessing they have them in a pile of slash or brush just to get scale. But I picture the person with the camera just saying, "Hey, Waldo, like just back up a little bit further, but keep backing up," because there's all this open area right in front of him. And then they make the guy stand right in the middle of the pile of brush. So a lot we can tell from these old photos. This is also in that report. This is the pine areas. So it's a little bit harder to see. This isn't going to help the people in Zoom, but we don't have the reservoir in blue, but you can see the reservoir. The pine areas were hit a lot harder and blew over or snapped off a lot of trees. And again, this time they let Waldo stand on the edge of the brush. So this is a kind of an overlay of that first map I was showing you in the center, along with this map that's on the left. The map on the left was the planting progress in the 1940s. So when they started planting out here, they were picking the spaces that were most available to planting. So they started with kind of open fields. And when you put those together, you can see a lot of the places that hurricane missed. And I'm not trying to say that in that dark shaded area, every tree was blown over. We know that's not true, but those were the areas that were either really young or impacted. And then you add on to where the open fields are, and it basically covers, a huge percentage of the Quabbin watershed was either affected by the hurricane, or it wasn't because the trees that were there were young and shorter. So just kind of giving you an idea. So basically the take-home message from all that is a lot of this forest started about the same time. We know we don't have a huge diversity of age. We know that the trees that are here are not those 300 or 400-year-old, quote, old growth trees. Most of them were started sometime in that period. So we'll do a brief history of forest management now that we have kind of a little bit of a history of the forest. 20s and 30s, the land was being acquired. They were concentrating on plantations and planting in the 20s and 40s. Really at Quabbin, the plantations started around 30s. They started a little earlier at Watershed because they had that property first. 50s and 70s, they were doing more thinning, where they were really thinking about those young stands that they had and trying to, a lot of this was from a timber production standpoint, really. They were thinking about trying to pick the best trees of the best species to grow for timber production. In the 80s, the thinking kind of shifted to water yield, and we'll go over. They had always been thinking about that a little bit, but there were some reasons that they really started thinking hard about it a little bit later. And then I'll talk about kind of where we're at now. This is a really neat picture too. This is just when you were coming into the visitor center. There's Blue Meadow Road on your left. These nurseries were right up there, and on the very right-hand screen, right above Waldo, you can see the end of the dam, the Windsor Dam. And then on the hillside, kind of in the top middle there, you can see the Quabbin Tower. So you're standing basically on the west shore of the reservoir, looking across where the reservoir would eventually be. It's already filling because that dam is complete, but this is 1941. So the dam wasn't even filled yet. So this is what it looked like back then. And this is a plantation where they were raising white pine. The nurseries began in 1935. So before the dam was even built, they were starting to think about the trees out here. In fact, one of the first two temporary nurseries that they built was in the reservoir area that hadn't filled yet. So there was a field there, they planted it, but obviously once they had that dam built, they had to relocate all the seedlings that were in that nursery and move them out of there before the water filled over it. The 1941 plan tells us that basically millions of seedlings were either bought, or more commonly what they did was they either bought or collected seed and then raised the seedlings from seed and eventually planted. And it was a mix of native and non-native species. So most of what got planted was red and white pine, but they also planted Norway red and spruce, Norway red and white spruce, hemlock, European larch, Scots pine, sugar maple, hickory, black walnut, and various other species. At the time of the report in 1941, they had planted almost 7 million trees, and they had another 13 million in this Belchertown nursery that they were going to be planting in the coming years. And they estimated they still had 10,000 acres that they needed to plant at that time. So plantations were a great way if you have all these open areas and you want forest land. You want to get the area revegetated and get it back to trees. From our perspective now, though, plantations are not ideal because we want a diversity of species and a diversity of age. And basically plantations are the exact opposite of that, right? All the trees are basically the exact same age because they were all planted the same day, basically. And typically when they were planting these plantations, it was only one or two species that they were planting at a time. Modern plantations, they're typically are trying to do a little bit more of a mix of species in places where they're doing that. But back then, the focus was really kind of timber production. They knew they wanted forest, but they were trying to plant trees that they thought would someday be a good crop of trees to harvest. Some plantations fared better than others, so not all those plantations that they planted actually developed into where all the trees fully grew. The open field plantations did generally better. They also tried planting some of those scrub oak areas, as they call them, and a lot of the seedlings that they had raised and planted ended up getting outcompeted by some of the native vegetation that was already growing back. The plan was really focused on timber production, and it describes obviously some of the results of the 38 hurricane. It also makes recommendations about kind of weeding and tending and pruning those plantations, investing in that in the future. And it casually says a force of 25 to 30 men was believed to be able to do that work in a few years, which you can tell labor was cheap back then, because it just kind of says, we only need 25 or 30 people, where today we don't ever think about anything like that. Unfortunately, World War II started kind of shortly after this, and although wood was in great demand, labor was in short supply, and so a lot of the work that had been recommended never really came to fruition. Another big source of data we have is the continuous forest inventory that Fred Hunt established for his master's thesis in 1961. It's based off the US Forest Service model. It's basically a way to take a sample of the forest and use kind of statistics and data analyzation. You go out and measure a random sample of the forest, and that can give you information about what's in the forest. And then if you keep going back every year or every period of time, usually we do it every 10 years, and remeasure the same plot and the same trees, you can see growth and trends in the forest over time. It becomes very useful information. So he, in his report, has some basic data showing what the Quabbin forest looked like in 1960 when he was measuring things. Basically, he says 70% of the stands were either oak or pine types. So oak pine dominated most of the area, which it basically still does. And that most of the stands were between 20 and 60 years old. So that makes sense, right? They had taken the land 20 years prior, basically. And at that time, there weren't a lot of old trees. And that was considered pretty good mix of ages back then, because you had some kind of middle-aged stands and you had some younger stands. It noted that less than 8% of the stands in the Quabbin were less than 20 years old, and most of those had originated from some forest fires that happened in that time period. And it also said that the area covered with stands that were older than 60 years was probably, in quotes, even less than 8%. He had some interesting information about regeneration. There was kind of a deer population explosion. And only one out of the 347 plots that he put on this grid actually had more than 1,000 stems per acre of regeneration, which is kind of the basic minimum that we look for in regeneration after a timber harvest. You want a lot of dense young trees coming in. They didn't really have that here, partially because those stands were younger, and so there probably wasn't a lot of sunlight on the ground. It was like kind of a closed canopy. All the trees were growing up, competing with each other. So it was partly the stand development stage that the stands were in, and partially just a big overpopulation of deer. So at Quabbin, we've remeasured these plots. They were established in 60. We remeasured them in 65, 70, 1980, 1990, 2000, 2010, and most recently in 2020. In Ware River, they were established in 1962 and kind of follow the same general collection pattern. What we measure has evolved over time, as kind of forestry has evolved, like any science. We've come a long way since 1960. So what we collect on these plots and how we analyze it and what we're looking for has changed. And basically that also, our management priorities have changed over that time. They've shifted a little bit. So it makes sense to shift what we're looking at. But the real power of the continuous forest inventory is that you have data all the way back to 1960 that you keep going back and remeasuring. So we don't want to change it too much. So in between the 60s and into the 80s, the focus changed to water quantity at Quabbin. There had been research done at Hubbard Brook Experimental Forest where they knew by kind of lowering the density of trees in a watershed, you could increase the water yield from that watershed. Makes sense. Trees suck up water, right? We already talked about how they slow that flow down. And so if you have less trees, you're going to get maybe more water going in. Maybe not ideal from water quality standpoints, but from water quantity, we know that you can increase the yield. And basically in 1967, the Quabbin had fallen to 45% capacity. So it was getting pretty low. They were getting pretty nervous. That was due to a severe drought. In 1980, the water demand by the communities that used the water was actually 50 million gallons a day above the safe water yield. So that's obviously a problem. And they were looking at diverting the Connecticut or Miller's River for added water. And they started looking pretty hard at land management at that point. And actually back then, they knew they had an overpopulation of deer, and they knew long-term that wasn't great, that would be a problem for regeneration, but it was kind of seen as a short-term benefit because those deer were chewing a lot of the younger vegetation and that would also be sucking up water. So they weren't in a big rush to tackle that problem. So some of this changed, or basically the quantity problem changed. They figured out that a good way to handle that would be to fix all the leaky old pipes in Boston and other places that were using the water. I mean, you think about it, there were literally wooden pipes in some places and a lot of lead pipes, and that was a definite no-no. And so they invested a lot of money, it was MDC at the time, but MWA is still investing money, updating the system and making it more efficient. And so they were actually, by 1990, they had dropped so the demand was back below the safe yield, and now we're pretty well below. We're almost 100 million gallons a day below, and they determined that now, okay, the forests are getting older. We need to be able to have some regeneration here. The high deer densities are more of a problem, and I really think about this. I know that there are people that really want to kind of lock this place up and make it a park or whatever. Long term, if you think about 100 years from now, we don't know what climate change is going to do. We don't know what weather patterns are going to change, and we don't know how many other communities are going to need this water. So taking away options for managing our forest, you're taking away some of the options that maybe could be used to solve some of those problems. So I really think about that in the context of that issue. So the forest is definitely not static. This is a picture on the bottom. This is a cemetery that's just over the Berry Falls Dam in the Ware River watershed in the town of Berry, Parker Cemetery. Back then they called it Barnes. I guess apparently Parker, that family was better at lobbying for the name because now they call it Parker Cemetery. But it's on Colebrook Road. And that photo is from 1941, and you can see the young forest in the background behind it. And then I recreated the photo in 2016, just to illustrate, that these trees most of the trees that we see have grown up since that time. So those 20 to 60-year-old forests now 60 years after that, or 80 years after that photo, are now all, 100 or 160 years old. So that's where we're currently at. And another thing we have to think about, back to this slide, is not only has all this happened, we lost the American chestnut to the blight, which was, horrifyingly unfortunate. I wish I had been alive to see what those forests look like. Chestnut was a huge dominant component of a lot of these forests and a really important tree. We removed, Smokey has done his job. We're pretty good at controlling forest fires in this area. It still is certainly a possibility with climate change that we could have some big fires, but for the most part, large scale fires have been removed. We've gotten rid of wolves and other large predators that might have helped control deer populations a little bit. We've added a lot of insects and diseases from other places where our trees aren't as resistant to them. Invasive plants, anyone who has dealt with invasive plants knows what a challenge that can be. And obviously climate change is a big issue that's exacerbating all of that stuff and just putting a lot more pressure on our forest. So it's not just this forest history, it's that there are a lot of man-made or human-caused issues that we're trying to deal with, which makes everything pretty complicated. So just to talk about some of the disturbances that affect our forests, these are the things that we think about. Hurricanes is what always keeps me up at night. And foresters will tell you we always are tracking the weather, but when I start hearing about hurricanes that are coming up, I'm always like in the back of my mind thinking, oh gosh, I hope it doesn't come here, because that was a mess and it would be a mess again. We obviously always also have microbursts and tornadoes. Ice storms can have a big impact. I don't know if anyone remembers, it wasn't even an ice storm, but last May, anyone who lives around here knows that there was a late frost that really affected oak trees, because the oak leaves were just coming out when that frost hit and damaged those leaves when they were vulnerable. And all of a sudden it looked like the crowns of all the oak trees had died because they dropped those leaves that had been damaged. Luckily, they had the reserves and the resources to put their leaves back out, so they recovered. But that's just an added stressor, and it really was interesting to see how it really hit the oaks, because they were the ones that their leaves were in that stage where they were vulnerable. Other trees, either their leaves had come out earlier and they were fine, or they hadn't really come out yet and they were fine. But the oaks got hit hard. And obviously insects and diseases that have been introduced. Usually, like I know the emerald ash borer came in pallets into Detroit. They were in the wood of the pallets and have now spread all the way across North America. And we're hopeful that it's not going to, but that could, there's been a lot of worry that would wipe out the species of ash in North America. And ash are great trees. And if you notice around here, most of the overstory ash that you see, most of any ash that you notice is dying or dead. So having a big impact already. Spongy moth has had a big issue out here, formerly known as gypsy moth. From 2017 to 2019 in Quabbin, we had multiple defoliations and a lot of oak mortality from spongy moth. Hemlock woolly adelgid has been a big one. And all of these things are exacerbated by climate change, right? That's always in the background. Certainly anything with the weather, the kind of intense, severe storms and precipitation events happen more frequently and are predicted to happen more frequently in the future. Just issues that we're thinking about and dealing with. Our comprehensive land management plan, this is basically governs everything that we do in the forests and some of our other land management activities. Certainly dictates, all of our forestry is spelled out in there. We update this every 10 years. All the watersheds are kind of combined into one plan now. It was last updated in 2017. And basically spells out our goals. So, the goals spelled out in this one are to create and maintain a forest that's resistant and resilient to disturbance. And we think that the best way to do that is to have a diversity of species, age, and structure. When we talk about forest structure, we're talking about kind of the height of the trees and the pattern that they're in. And that's, vertical structure and also horizontal structure as you're going across the landscape. We really want to prevent any negative impacts from any management we do, right? So we're focused on that, looking at road maintenance, best management practices. We're kind of unique in that we break our watersheds up into sub watersheds. So looking at smaller sections of watersheds And we don't want to impact more than 25%. That comes from some research at Hubbard Brook and other places. We don't want to impact more than 25% of any subwatershed over a 10-year period, because research shows that's really when you can start having some negative water quality effects. And as long as you don't do that and you have some filter strips where you're kind of protecting right along stream and water edges, we know that we can do some management without having a negative impact. The plan also really looks at protecting and enhancing biodiversity. So not just thinking about trees, but thinking about all the species that live in our forests and on our land. So we look at controlling invasive plants, and where we can, we identify and try to protect or enhance rare, uncommon species in their habitat. And we also look at creating some chunks of early successional or young forest for some of the species that need that. A lot of those species are in decline. So we do a little bit of that, but that's a very small part of what we do. So how is it different than normal forestry? In a lot of ways, it's not that different. If you're practicing good forestry, you're already protecting water quality, you're already protecting endangered species and thinking about habitat. We're different because clean water is our absolute most valuable product. We're not managing our forest to try to maximize growth or revenue from cutting trees. That really plays no part in what I'm thinking about. As I said, our budget is paid by Mass Water Resource Authority. My salary and our budget has no bearing how many trees we're cutting, what that is. So it really doesn't factor into it at all. We're really managing for diversity and resilience. So I already talked about the other two. So a little bit more specifically how we do it, we say we want to regenerate 1% of the managed forest annually. And that's an important point I haven't brought up yet, is basically 75 to 80% of the land that we own, we consider unmanaged or unmanageable. So if you think about it, like I'm sorry, I said that wrong. 20 to 25% of our land we consider unmanaged or unmanageable. So if you think about like the islands in Quabbin, they actually, I think back in the 60s when the drought was there, they did actually move logging equipment out to an island and do a harvest, but that's nothing we would consider today, even if the water level was that low. Those were different times. We don't do any of our typical silviculture forest management on the islands. Obviously, there's lots of steep slopes. We stay away from forested wetlands. Legally, you can do some harvesting in forested wetlands. We choose not to because we're water supply. And other access issues. We also have areas that we intentionally set aside for management, like the Potapog natural area in Quabbin that we set aside, 20 or 30 years ago. I think that's somewhere between 1,000 and 2,000 acres. It's a pretty big chunk that we set aside just to kind of see what happens and as an experiment. So of the remaining 75 to 80% of the forest land that we do manage, our goal is to regenerate 1% of that annually. So we're trying to basically get a new age class of trees going. We know that most of our overstory trees are about the same age. We want to do that basically in small chunks scattered across the landscape. So we're basically trying to mimic natural disturbance, particularly like wind events, that would make this forest more diverse over a long period of time, just like that slide with the pre-forests. Over a long period of time, that diversity would come in. We're trying to kind of build that in now, speed it up a little bit. And we're also trying to kind of place that disturbance intentionally so that it can be timed and located to minimize any potential negative effects and to maximize the benefits from that disturbance that will most align with our goals. So we use kind of group selection or patch cuts. That bottom left kind of gives you an idea. Small openings in the forest, typically 1 or 2 acres, sometimes up to 5, where we're removing most of the overstory. Generally are leaving some residual trees in those openings, but we're trying to get sunlight onto the ground, basically, so that we get the diverse species back that we really want. The openings by default are breaking up the age structure, right? That's pretty obvious. But we try to locate and size and time them for the right time and the right light conditions, so that we get a diverse species, diverse mix of species coming back. And generally, we're targeting areas, obviously, that have low overstory diversity already for this. That's our highest priority, is locating those areas. Plantations are like the prime example, as I mentioned earlier. But we're also looking for areas that are vulnerable for forest health issues or other reasons. So one thing I did want to point out, there's a lot of laws and regulations here in Massachusetts. Here's a partial list of some of the big ones that we do. We're public drinking water, so we definitely fall under the first one. But I have to be licensed to be a forester in the state, and that comes with education and experience requirements and continuing education requirements. Just like anybody else in this state, we are subject to the Mass Forest Cutting Practices Act. It's overseen by the DCR service foresters. And so we have to do everything to comply with those, just like you would if you were cutting trees on private land. The Mass Endangered Species Act, obviously, Mass Wetlands Protection Act, and then there's also the Federal Endangered Species Act, and OSHA is a big one to think about. So that thinking about that more than 90% of the wood used in the state comes from somewhere else. What the regulations and the oversight is here. Some of the places where that other wood is coming from might have some of this. Some other places, if it's coming from Eastern Europe or South America, who knows what the regulations are, and who knows. I'm glad that we have, that the public has input on what we do here, and people have the right to come and give us their opinion. People in other countries might not have that luxury, so there's kind of an environmental justice piece of this too. So it's important to keep that in mind. So we just wanted to quickly go over the harvest process that we go through. This is not like we just show up and start cutting trees. There's a lot of thought and planning that goes into this. So the forestry lot proposal is where it starts. Layout, marking, preparing the cutting plan, preparing the bid, some of the public outreach we do, and then overseeing the active harvest, and then even after the harvest is done, kind of post-harvest and long-term monitoring. Forestry lot proposals. This is an internal and public process. So it starts with the internal. Typically, foresters preparing several proposals in a given year. And that involves a lot of field reconnaissance and mapping, looking at maps and photos and LiDAR, which I'll talk about later. Many considerations are given when thinking about where to prioritize cutting some trees or doing a harvest. Basic priorities would be looking for areas that lack in the diversity of species and ages of overstory trees. And we're looking at this on a landscape level. Plantations is one prime example. Pasture pine, old field white pine is typically dominated by a lot of white pine that's low quality and came in after agricultural uses. Those are some areas that we target. Or we're looking for areas with forest health issues. And we're really trying to mimic the natural disturbances and control the sunlight, as I said earlier. So the forester basically writes up and describes the proposal area, including obviously the forest stands, and the regeneration. So obviously we're talking about trees, but we're also talking about the water resources that are there, and mapping everything, looking at soils. Soils is where everything starts and plays a big part in this. And we're looking at stone walls and cultural resources, mapping all that, making sure that we know where everything is. And we're thinking about the presence of natural heritage, endangered species, and thinking about wildlife habitat, thinking about deer and moose browse levels, and invasive plants, all the things that could have an impact on that site. So we describe what our goals are and what we want to accomplish, and how we're going to do that. And then basically we have an internal review where water supply staff weighs in on it. So our road maintenance crew is looking at the road infrastructure, making sure that we can access the site. Our environmental quality crew, the people that do all the water sampling for the filtration waiver and are looking at the water chemistry, they review to make sure there's no issues with water quality. Our natural resource staff, our biologists, are looking at wildlife, natural heritage issues. And then the DCR archaeologist in Boston reviews all of our proposals, looking for issues with cultural resources and concerns. And all those people can give input and make comments and kind of tell us if we need to adjust something. So once that's happened and we've kind of think that the proposal is where it needs to be, it goes out to a public process. So the proposals are posted online, which is what the maps on the right-hand side are. And we present them at public meetings. So we have public advisory committees that oversee what we do, or shouldn't say oversee what we do. They give input on what we do. And we offer public tours of proposals and conduct public tours if people want to come. So that gives the public a chance to weigh in with their concerns and their local knowledge. There's a lot of times people walking around out here who know some of these places even better than we do, and they can weigh in on any issues. That process, typically from the time a forester starts walking an area thinking about it to when we're through public review and the public comment period, it's usually at least 6 months, sometimes close to a year before that process is completed. So not happening overnight. But once it does happen, the next phase is the forester would go out and lay out an actual harvest. So we do that by pretty intensively walking the area with, typically we have a paint gun. So you might see some painted trees out there. That's how the forester is communicating basically how that harvest is going to happen, where the equipment's going to be, what trees are actually going to be cut, what trees aren't going to be cut, where the equipment's going to be. We use basically paint and flagging. And that's really the forester setting this all up so that whatever logger comes, they're not deciding things that we want to make the decisions about. We're making all the decisions ahead of time based on our knowledge of the site conditions and what we want to happen on that site. So that's really kind of the first part of this. The cutting plan is required by that Massachusetts Forest Cutting Act, just like anybody else. So we develop that. As we're marking the trees, we're also tallying them, and we use that to calculate the volume of wood by species and product that's going to be cut. That helps us develop the bid. This ends up getting bid out to loggers and mills. And so we have to be able to tell them this is the amount of wood here so that they have an idea of what they're bidding on. We bring them out for a tour. It's a very open public process because we're the state. We have to meet some pretty rigorous standards when we are selling anything. And so we go through this public bid process. The winning bidder is typically given 2 years to complete the harvest. And there's a lot of good reasons for that I'll talk about in a minute. Typically after that, before the harvest starts, we're producing a web posting, which is another kind of public facing document so that people, if they are interested, can go and see what our harvests look like, what we're doing. We have the cutting plan right on there typically, and some maps and some information. We prepare a signboard, which is the top right there with the orange certificate and a map and some information about what we're doing and why we're doing it, and our contact info. There's a little scan code so you can scan it and get some online information. So that's if you're out walking in the woods and see an active harvest, you can, if you're curious about it, you know who to call or you know where to get more information. And then on some of our harvests, we establish photo points. So that's what the 3 photos are. That's all taken from the same point. Looking at a harvest, the top left is the pre-harvest photo that was taken before the harvest started. The top right is the immediate post-harvest photo. So right after the harvest was completed, we go back try to take the same photo, and we're always looking for landmarks like trees in a road to try to frame that picture. So it's obvious that it's the same place. And then we go back after 1 growing season, after 3 growing seasons, after 5 growing seasons, after 10 growing seasons, and after 20 growing seasons. We haven't been doing this for 20 years. We haven't got to the 21, any 20s yet. I have a couple that are coming up in Ware River in the few years, but this is a 10-year post-harvest photo. So you can see we put some sunlight on the ground. We cut a few of the trees that weren't doing as well, and we got a dense, thick, new forest with hopefully diverse species. Once the harvest actually starts, or I should say even before the harvest actually starts, we're thinking about best management practices. So we're keeping a close eye on weather, and sometimes a logger will call us and say, hey, I won that lot a month ago. Can I start it? And we'll say, oh, I don't know. It's been kind of rainy or whatever. Let me go take a look. And we'll go out and walk it sometimes with the logger, or sometimes, depending on their schedule, just on our own, and actually look at the site conditions. And a lot of times we call them back and say, no, you're not ready to start. So that's kind of the first BMP that we're thinking about is planning. And then once the harvest is started, we're using the picture on the left is the Massachusetts Best Management Practices Manual. A lot of those best management practices are actually required by law. They're all set up to protect soil and water resources for the most part. That's what we're thinking about. And making sure that the site can handle that harvest and the equipment that's there without damaging the soil or without damaging the stream. The pictures on the bottom are an example of what we might do. The best stream crossing, we always say, is no stream crossing. So we try to avoid crossing a stream, basically through planning. But if we have to cross a stream to access an area, we are typically using what they call skidder bridges or panels on the left-hand picture there, where they have a nice footer and are either with rocks or in this case, the logger actually placed some logs there to hold those bridges up. They do the harvest, run the equipment over, and then at the end, they pull those bridges, and you are basically left with an undisturbed, basically still vegetated stream channel, so that we're protecting that water. So there's a whole list of BMPs in that manual, for anything from water bars to even just how you lay out your harvest, the timing, and this is something we're constantly thinking about. It's something you have to adjust as the weather changes, obviously. So we're tracking the weather and keeping an eye on ground conditions and making sure that BMPs are in place. We do really strict supervision on our harvests. So if we have an active harvest, foresters we have foresters on staff that are checking on those harvests regularly. If somebody goes on vacation, I know about it. And if they have an active harvest, I know that either myself or another forester has to be able to cover, particularly if there's some weather coming in. And actually, some of our oversight, as I explained, starts before. We also, before loggers land on any equipment on our land, we have to inspect the equipment to make sure that it's not leaking any fuel or hydraulic fluid. And we also check for soil and vegetation on the logging equipment, because if it was coming from a site that had invasive shrubs, there could be seeds or pieces of vegetation that if it comes and it gets on our property, then now we have invasive species where we didn't have them. We don't want to spread that. So we require an inspection of equipment before it lands on us. And after the harvest, we do some post-harvest monitoring. Generally, we're doing regeneration surveys and looking at invasive species in those surveys. We typically do those 15 years post-harvest, so that's a long time. We're typically going back before that and seeing what's coming back up in those harvests, but we do an official kind of scientific survey where we're actually going to random plots and measuring trees about 15 years post-harvest, because at that point we can really tell what trees are winning, and that gives us a good picture of what that future stand is going to look like. We also have the forest inventory, the continuous forest inventory. When we do those if there's an area where we're doing some management and there's a CFI plot there, we just kind of pretend it's not there. So if we would normally be cutting some of the trees on that plot, they get cut. We're not trying to protect those. That helps us gauge what our actual management is doing. So that's another source. And we look at regeneration on those. That's another source of long-term monitoring that we have. We do deer and moose monitoring, usually pellet counts. That's something that our natural resource staff, our biologists, are doing so that they can kind of monitor population trends. We introduced deer hunting back into Quabbin in sections that hadn't been hunted in the 90s, which was pretty controversial, but basically knew that we had to control that deer population. And we're able to get the deer population now to where we should be able to regenerate trees. There's a kind of a long legacy of a high population of deer that you have to overcome. It's not like just as soon as you get rid of some deer that the forest just pops back and everything's healthy. There's, they've been in there chewing everything for so long that it changes the composition of that forest and takes a while to get it back. Moose came in right after we started that program. So that was a kind of an added twist. And in Massachusetts, there's really no control measures that we have for moose, unfortunately. So we have to think a little bit harder about how to deal with those, and they can have a big impact on our forest. We also do water quality sampling. Obviously, as I've mentioned many times, our environmental quality staff did sampling on stream crossings on harvest, where they went and did sample prior to a harvest, and then would come back when the harvest was active and take samples. And then after the harvest was done, come back and take more samples. We did that for many years, and basically environmental quality analyzed the data and said, you guys are not having any impact. Your BMPs are working pretty well here. So we actually just recently stopped doing that. We also have long-term paired watershed study in Quabbin, which is the top right-hand corner, where we took two similar watersheds that were pretty close to each other. And one is kind of the control, and the other one we did specific management activities over a number of years and have been analyzing that data. And that's actually getting to the point where we're going to have some data coming out of that. So looking forward to seeing that. That's been done in many other places. So we have lots of research already, but we wanted some Quabbin specific data. So I'm probably I don't even know what time it is. I'm probably already way over time. I apologize. I just wanted to walk you guys through kind of a project so that you could see how it looks. This ended up becoming Harvest Lot 4377 in Ware River. It started off by looking at compartment 20. So compartments are kind of an administrative tool that foresters use, so that the forester in Ware River doesn't have to look at all 24,000 acres in the Ware River. We've kind of broken that forest up into chunks. And like, for instance, compartment 20 is, I think, around 537 acres. So you're basically looking at a few compartments every year, and you try to get back to every compartment every 10 years to make sure you're looking at the entire ownership. And it just makes it a little bit easier to focus in on a specific area. We're still thinking about the whole watershed if there's like a forest health issue or something else going on, but on a yearly basis, this is kind of where we start, is at the compartment level. This compartment is the kind of triangle you see in the top right, or whatever shape that is, rhombus, is that's actually Berry Falls Dam. So if anybody knows where that is, this is right next to that. The picture in the center is an aerial photo. So we use those quite a bit. Gives you a lot of information about what's out there, getting the view from the sky. The picture on the right is pretty interesting. So I don't know how many people are familiar with LiDAR. I actually had to write it down because I always forget. It stands for light detection and ranging. So it's a remote sensing technique that's fairly new. So usually flown from an airplane or a helicopter. Now they're doing it from drones, where it uses pulsed lasers that they shoot down at the ground and then bounce back up. And it gives you a really accurate 3D model of the ground and ground features, and you can use it on vegetation as well. Really accurate mapping, where sometimes the pixels are like meter by meter pixels. I think this is from the 2013 flight that was done of the whole state of Massachusetts. And I think those meters were, or those pixels were like 3 meters by 3 meters. So not as good resolution as what you can get, but really good resolution. And one of the things that you can kind of work out is you can get a really accurate map of the height of the forest canopy. So that's what that map is. Basically anything that's dark green is 0 to 20 feet tall. And so you can see a lot of the really hard green, like inside of compartment 20, those are fields that we mow in Ware River and maintain field habitat. And then kind of the orange and the red are the taller trees. Anything orange is what, 80 to 100 feet tall. Red is 100 to 120 feet tall. So it gives you a quick snapshot of one of the things that we are thinking about is the height of that canopy. You know, doesn't do everything for us, but it's just one of the tools that we use that I wanted to show you. So after the forester looked at this compartment, he kind of homed in on the red area in the kind of top right-hand corner there, and that became proposal WR Ware River 09. So this was a 2009 proposal. That's what the 09 means. 20 is it's in compartment 20, and then 7. This was he must have had at least 7 proposals that year. And this was a pretty small one. I think the proposal was about 10 acres. Some of our proposals might be 200. Typically, we're not cutting, you know, every acre in that 200 acres, you know, but the proposal footprint might cover a bigger area, and then we just are doing some harvesting on portions of that. This one was he got a pretty specific footprint. So now we've zoomed into just that proposal area. And this was on the left hand, this harvest was completed in 2010. So on the left hand is a 2008 or the pre-harvest photo. In the center is the 2011 photo, so right after the harvest. And then on the right-hand side is that canopy height layer zoomed in. So basically on this proposal, there was a patch of red pine, planted red pine in the kind of bottom left corner. And you can see that in the canopy height layer. Now that's green because it was a plantation. They went in and cut all of the red pine, a couple acres. And there was some low quality kind of slow growing white pine and hardwood that the forester wanted to take out, and did some small patches, left some retention, and that really shows up in that kind of canopy height layer map where you can still see the red. There's still plenty of tall trees in there. Orange are the slightly less tall trees, but still pretty tall. You know, so you have kind of more diversity of tree heights. And that's kind of really what we're aiming for. These are the photo points I showed you earlier, but those photo points were from this harvest. This is standing on Colebrook Road. So after 10 growing seasons now, we still have, you can see in the top picture, there was still plenty of trees on that site, but in those patches where we put some sunlight on the ground, we have a really dense forest coming back up. And I think this is almost my last slide, second to last slide. So this is from, this data came from our CFI. Basically, it's from 1970 to 2010. So we have 2020 data. We haven't come up with a updated graph that looks this nice, but the general trend is the same. Where over time, wherever you see those trees growing in that line that's trending up, we're looking at metric tons of carbon above ground per acre. And that has been going steadily up since 1970. And that's while we've done over 1,000 forest management operations at Quabbin in that time frame. So we know basically that we are growing more trees and more wood than what we're actually harvesting. We know actually in the most recent 2020 data that we're still analyzing, for the first time, Brian, our CFI guru, who's in the back of the room, broke out the plots that we were looking at and looked at plots that were unmanaged versus plots that had some management history. So as I said, there's a lot of areas that we don't actually get to. So we have plots in those areas that we still measure for the continuous forest inventory. So we kind of define that by a managed plot was any plot that had ever had a tree cut. And when we're going back and remeasuring all those plots, we note if a tree was cut, we know each individual tree, they're all numbered. We know it was there 10 years ago. If a tree got cut, we note that. So we know, okay, this tree was actually a stump, as opposed to, oh, that tree died because of insects or disease or just competition or natural mortality. So that's all noted. We know what caused those trees to die. So on the plots that it actually had management, we're still adding more biomass above ground. On the plots that are unmanaged, actually for the first time, the above ground biomass dipped slightly. So it actually went down on our unmanaged plots. And we think that's probably because of the spongy moth outbreak that happened shortly before this round of CFI. So that was pretty interesting and has some pretty interesting ramifications. As I said, more than 93% of the wood used in Massachusetts comes from somewhere else. So really, I think wood is good. Wood has a lower carbon footprint than any other building material that we could use. If you think about, common building material, basically, if you think about like steel or any kind of metal, concrete, brick, plastic, glass, any of those are way more carbon intensive. And wood that's grown locally is even less carbon intensive, right? I think wood is good. And forest management, the forest management that we do, our goal is really to grow trees for the long term. The land that you see is not going to be developed. It's going to be forest land. That's our goal. That's what we're trying to do long term. The management that we do, we're focused on water, and we're thinking about climate change, but it also achieves a lot of other goals, including some of our habitat goals and other things. So from a lot of perspectives, that's good. And just the take home, some of the stuff we talked about. Clean water is our MVP, our most valuable product. And forests change on their own, and all this land is permanently protected. So keeping forests is the best thing we can do for climate change. And luckily, that's what we're trying to do here.